All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Pitch Hackers interview series. Today's episode features Alex Harstrick, the driving force behind J2 Ventures. Alex's career has been a journey of diverse roles, from his military intelligence work with the U.S. Army Reserve to becoming a Harvard MBA alum, to his instrumental role in Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield of New Jersey's strategy and venture arm. He's now at the cutting edge of his own venture capital firm, backing startups that are breaking new ground with government collaborations. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Mel.
I think just to kick us off, give us a broad idea of what J2 Ventures is, and then I can dive into more questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So J2 Ventures invests at the intersection of national security-focused technology, government-focused technology, and deep tech, where we feel the government can play a very large role in helping those companies scale, whether it be at the very early stages or as the companies grow at the very latest stages. Our team deliberately has a pretty diverse amount of exposure in this, whether it be from pure play academia to government contracting to municipal contracting. And we feel the sort of the combination of those assets, the focus, and our individual experience gives us an edge in both sourcing and scaling with these companies.
That's great. It's great. Something that comes to mind is, venture capital and government are often seen as two very different worlds. In your experience, what are the key misconceptions about this relationship, and how does your venture firm bridge that gap?
I think a deep history lesson on this would disagree with the notion that venture capital and government are anathema. I mean, the first venture capital fund that most people sort of credit, American Research and Development Corporation, was actually founded by a Harvard alum, served in the Army in World War II, that financed almost uniquely government-backed assets. And so when you think about what the government is, when it's actually spending taxpayer dollars on individual technologies, it is a price indiscriminate entity that just wants the best. And so if I were to design the best customer, I would probably want exactly that. No matter how much it's going to cost me to build what they want, they'll pay for it, they'll help me scale it, while at the same time actually taking very little by way of exclusivity and owning those technologies moving forward. So there's some nuance that probably goes beyond the interests of what we want to talk about on this podcast. But in reality, I would argue that venture and government have always been intertwined, and it was only a recent phenomenon in the last maybe 15 years that people started to divorce themselves from this. But if you look at any real big technology breakthrough, at some level, more often than not at the very earliest stages, the government has been central to the development of that.
Super interesting. And just touching back on your background in the military service, are there any principles or strategies that you've taken from that experience that have adapted for your use in venture capital and building your firm?
I think the business world is full of people using military acronyms or analogies in situations that I actually think are pretty inappropriate to use them. I've been in more war rooms in a business setting than I have in the military setting. And that's not for lack of trying in the military setting. I just think these things are overly prolific. But the biggest lesson, I think, from both sides where they really intersect, and it makes sense that they would intersect, is in the military, we would say everything you should do should be done fast and in a hurry, right? So if the commanding officer wants something done, there's a certain amount of time that you would want a clarification on this issue, make sure that you're executing correctly, but you want to make sure you're doing it quickly, you want to make sure that you're doing it well. The best rule that I have given to any startup founder, whether it be in an introduction to an investor, an introduction to a potential hire, or an introduction to a customer, is time kills deals. There's no situation where taking more time to get something done, whether it be in the military or in the startup world, venture world, business world in general, where time has been additive to the person trying to accomplish something, getting more of what they want. I think occasionally there will be some circumstances where it turns out that because something was unable to get done, it might have worked out well for the company or something. But those are easy to recall, largely because they are so anomalous. More often than not, moving quickly, getting things done quickly is to the benefit of the person trying to get something done.
This kind of deviates from our questions, but what does a typical contract or partnership or collaboration with government and your VC firm / the startups that you have in your portfolio, what does that look like?
It typical is difficult to say because the government actually has a pretty diverse set of contract mechanisms. There's actually multiple regulations that go over this. In fact, one of the most exciting of them, what's called an Other Transaction Authority, just went over an overhaul that was announced, I think, yesterday. So the government is actually pretty frequently revisiting the processes by which it works with these individual startups. And so typical is difficult to define because even within the government budget, there are multiple what they call colors of money that are applicable only for certain use cases. And most of those colors of money will come down to preordained congressionally pockets of things that the government is allowed to spend money on. So I think the biggest confusion that people have is they see the defense budget, they say $800 billion, and that's the applicable end market. But it's not, right? Most of that has actually been earmarked for something, whether it be salaries for service members, whether it be food and beverage, whether it be Oklahoma-class submarines, all of these kinds of things. And so the more art than science in working with these companies is understanding the dynamic nature of the contracts, because if what you are trying to do is a one-size-fits-all approach, you should not be seeking a venture capitalist to help you with that. There are actually a lot of advisory firms that will do that for you. They promise to get you a contract at a certain amount of time. You pay them for a success fee. Those firms provide a ton of value. No good venture capital fund should try and push a company into proving that that venture capital fund is valuable by pursuing something that may not be in the best interest of the long-term value of the company, which could be pursuing a government contract.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, another question that comes to mind too is what outside of your thesis, what do you look for in these companies to stay aligned with both VC and government needs, knowing that it varies so much?
Yeah, and sometimes it varies, Mel. Sometimes it doesn't, right? And I think that's where the selection is so important in picking the companies where a dueling go-to-market motion will not destroy one or the other. Because I think that's actually kind of where it comes down. It's that the customers, they're still human beings at the end of the day. They still want some product shipped. They want that product to accomplish some kind of end goal. And so where it becomes difficult is when that expectation begins to deviate. So if somebody says, the commercial world, for example, you're wearing an Oura ring, right? Oura works pretty closely with the government. If the government were to say, Oura, I don't want any of the colors that you have now. I want you to install all of these sensors, and I want you to have to do XYZ additional capabilities that are extremely expensive. It would not be in Oura Ring's best interest to make all of those changes to service a contract that only allowed them to break even without any kind of replicability and revenue in the future. And so I would argue that that's a case of no matter how big the contract is, it's a bad contract. Whereas if you were to say, Oura, you're making an amazing product. I like exactly how it is now, and I want to buy a bunch of them, but I need a software layer on the back end that's going to do something kind of special. It won't cost you very much to build it. That totally makes sense. There's really no enterprise client that would have an expectation different. And so when you look at companies, and Oura happens to be one of our portfolio companies, but when you look at individual companies that are making these kinds of decisions, both selecting them at the beginning and then guiding them towards the end, that criteria must be met at each individual gating function. Otherwise, I would argue the company should walk away from the government first before they walk away from the commercial market.
It's great. That's super interesting, and I feel like many folks probably haven't even thought about that aspect. I mean, this kind of touches on this, but it goes one step deeper. What are some of the most significant challenges you face when fostering collaboration between government entities and venture-backed companies?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's odd because if you do it well, you don't run into the same challenges twice. You learn your lessons pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. But back to that point about pacing, I think the bigger issue is not that the government's heart is in the right place, but rather the startup has certain expectations of revenue ramp after each individual funding round. And it's difficult to be overly reliant on a single customer that is a government entity to be able to achieve the things that I think other VCs that may not be sensitive to this thesis would expect them to achieve.
Yeah.
right? And the other sort of aspect that's difficult to explain to both sides is what you're really looking at, Mel, when you're working with any kind of customer is at the end of the day, this is going to be read on a spreadsheet from somebody who is indifferent to who the customer is. And so when you think about the quality of revenue, the replicability of revenue, the speed to revenue, and the growth of that revenue stream, that is really difficult to optimize if you don't know what you're doing when you enter into one of these relationships. And so I would say for those who are uninitiated, it can be really difficult. You would push a company to do something that actually might be foolish from a growth point of view in working with the wrong customer. And I think when you see people that are less adept at the industry, you see them doing that a lot. Whereas one of the things that we've become very good at J2 Ventures is making sure that we titrate the type of customer, the type of contract, and the relationships broadly so they can move at a startup pace. And so the companies are never hampered by their customer.
That's great. I'm curious, from your experience, how has the collaboration between government and private tech companies evolved over the past, year really with AI and, maybe 3 years in different markets? And where do you see it going over the next 5 years, knowing that AI is already exploding?
Yeah, the AI is sort of a bespoke issue, and there are a lot of people that know a lot more about AI specifically than I do. We do invest in artificial intelligence companies, but if I were to talk about any of the individual modalities, I think there's someone who might be better qualified. For example, my co-founder who got his PhD in computational chemistry, so functionally this area, and which is great. It's if you hire the right team, then you don't have to be an expert at everything, and that's kind of what we've done at J2. One of the things I'm actually most excited about is the team that works with us. We have a partner, Christine Kung. She's amazing, extraordinarily well connected in Silicon Valley, just knows absolutely everybody, very, very good at helping companies scale from a more traditional point of view. Dr. Matt Goldman served 22 years in the Air Force, is still an attending at Stanford University Hospital, and has forgotten more about, I just name an esoteric subject than most people would ever know. And then a principal on our team, Will Hallesley, who is just extraordinary, worked at the National Security Council, a bunch of other funds, to our advisory network, Jeff Orizem, Yuri Lopez. So all of these individual people are really, really helpful at building all of the pieces that we find are kind of blind, in addition to the government. And so I think the things that excite me are not that companies want to work with the government more. It's that outside of any kind of explicit connectivity, so whether you have like a 4-star general or the former whatever working with you, it's much easier to work with the government now than it ever has been before. And I would argue one of the common failure modes that we're seeing is people think that you have to pay somebody really senior to work with you in order to get access. But I would argue that that's actually not in the best interests of the company, and that there are a lot of mechanisms. In fact, last count I had, there were over 70 different mechanisms which were in charge of doing innovation just within the Department of Defense. And everybody, to include venture capitalists from the all the way to the government, will struggle with some sort of deal flow aspect. Venture capitalists need to deploy money. The government also needs to deploy money. Otherwise, their budgets are cut. So being able to work with these individual entities, they want you to come to them. And they don't need somebody to make the introduction in advance. They are hungry to meet the next best thing. And the credibility often stands on its own. And I think as time goes on, Mel, you're going to see fewer and fewer people talking about a government-specific strategy, and more of people saying that there should be an inherent alignment in working with government if you are investing in deep or frontier technology.
I love it. Anything that you'd want to leave the audience with, early stage founders trying to get capital in this environment, or investors looking for new investments? Anything before we hop off?
Outside of the deal flow argument, which I think is important, everybody is looking to deploy. There's nobody who just has some magic behind a curtain that you are not privy to. They're all human beings. They all feel sick. They all worry about different things and sort of managing their portfolios. So I would never be intimidated in going into a relationship. If it turns out that you are intimidated and there's an issue in interfacing with that person, I think it's easy for people to take those things personally. I would argue that this is a very intimate relationship. You are literally giving somebody a part of your life's work. So if that relationship feels awkward, there's a side of you that should say, well, maybe it wasn't meant to be. And the last thing I would sort of leave people with is the fundamentals will have never and will never go out of style. Regardless of what people say, growth at all costs, it's gone. That's not true. You should still be growing quickly. But at some level, every company has a scoreboard, and that scoreboard is revenue growth. So if you are able to show that you can scale, there will always be a market. There will always be somebody who wants to invest in that. Just because you don't have the network to be able to access that investor does not mean that the idea is not valuable. And I would say similarly, a lot of people focus on aspects that I think are not interesting to investors, like the bespoke qualities of the actual technology, some other sort of esoteric aspects of the company. But if you can just show there's a big market and I'm making a lot of money in that market and I'm growing quickly, there will always be somebody who wants to give you money to do that, regardless of the market.
It's great. But that's literally what I do. Some of my favorite people to work with are researchers, software engineers, to go from in-depth analysis of what they're building to making this as attractive as possible to the people who can make their dreams possible.
Yeah, awesome.
Folks like you. So thank you so much, Alex. Appreciate your time. Feel better. He's hopping on today when he's sick. So I really appreciate it.
Cool. Thank you very much, Mel. I appreciate you having me on.